Another scar. That's what it was, you ken? A new one, shimmering like fractured glass against the ochre haze, a rough tear in the desolate landscape. The haze was a gritty film that coated everything, irritating the eyes. You could almost taste the rust in it. And the edges, they shimmered with a violet hue, like a bruise on the sky. The air within the scar appeared thicker, distorting the landscape behind it like a warped lens. We called them time scars, each one a reminder of the day the clock broke, the day time stopped being a line and became a goddamn mosaic, all jumbled and jagged. The Great Fracture. They called it a lot of things. I just called it the day the world went sideways. It happened fast, you ken? Not like in the movies, no big countdown or anything. 1 minute everything's normal, the next, chaos. Time-regulated systems went haywire, and then the first scars appeared, visible fractures in the sky, shimmering like heat haze but cold. And the echoes, snippets of sound from the past, playing on a loop, trapped in pockets of fractured time. The first time I heard it, I thought I was going mad. A distorted melody, fragmented and ever-shifting, echoing across the ruined city. It was like the world was having a nervous breakdown, its memories bleeding into the present. They called it the Fracture Song, a soundtrack to the end of the world. I'd heard it plenty of times since. I traced the outline of the Cartographer's insignia, a stylized hourglass shattered into a radial pattern, on the worn leather strap of my chrono gauntlet with my finger, a subconscious habit. The gauntlet was our primary tool, a complex device worn on the forearm that measured temporal distortions, analyzed the fragmented timelines, and allowed us to navigate the fractured landscape. It was part sophisticated sensor array, part survival tool, with a rugged, reinforced casing and a multifaceted display that showed real-time temporal readings. Each new scar was a crack in the ice, a sign that things were getting worse, not better. My chrono gauntlet confirmed what my eyes already knew, a fresh fracture in the fabric. It wasn't large, not yet, but it was growing. The readings were chaotic, a tangled web of crimson lines, like a snarl of threads, each line representing a different temporal frequency, clashing and colliding. We were cartographers, Chronal cartographers, fancy name for scavengers, really. We mapped the fractures, the slivers of broken time, looking for stable pockets, anomalies, anything that could help the eggheads with their grand project. They changed the name every few years. Project Hourglass, Project Kronos, the Haven Initiative. Hard to keep track. We were supposed to be on a routine survey mapping the outer fractures. Command had reported a surge in temporal activity in this sector, something about a new type of anomaly. But this was something else entirely. The project was aimed at understanding what went wrong, at finding a way to mend the fractures, or at least to find stable zones where humanity could, not die. But I didn't buy it. You can't unscramble an egg, you can. I glanced at my own worn data chip, a relic from before containing pre-fracture music, a collection of old tunes. A song called Starry Serenade was one of my favorites, a slow, melancholic melody that always made me think of a clear night sky full of stars. I had a particular interest in that era, fueled by old holovids, a time of relative peace. The comms buzzed, a brief vibration against my wrist. It was Ford. He was my second in command, a veteran cartographer, more cynical than me if you could believe it. I trusted him, more or less. He had a knack for finding trouble, but he was good in a tight spot. He was also a bit of a wild card, driven by his own motivations, his own ghosts. Ford's voice, thick with his usual cynicism, came through. "Anything, Point Man?" He always called me that. Point Man, like I was still leading a squad into some hot zone, back when I wore a uniform and carried a rifle instead of a gauntlet and a scanner. "New scar," I replied, my voice gruff. "East by southeast, sizable, unstable, and different." "Damn," he muttered. "Another one. They're popping up like radroaches these days." He paused. Different how? Too soon to tell, I said, but even as I spoke, the resonance scanner in my other hand began to emit a rhythmic, almost melodic tone, a distinct two-tone sequence like a signal. It was coming from the direction of the new scar. Hold that thought, Ford. Got a signature. Two-tone, rhythmic. Almost like music, you ken? But off. The signal was like a half-forgotten melody that tugged at the edges of my memory, a tune that was both familiar and foreign at the same time. I checked the readings again. The signature was unusual, a harmonic pattern I'd never encountered before. It was interfering with the temporal readings, creating a strange interference pattern on the gauntlet's display, a series of concentric circles rippling outwards from a central point, each ring a different shade of crimson. We moved towards the source, our boots crunching on the surface that covered much of the wasteland. The landscape was a graveyard of broken time, a desolate expanse of twisted metal, petrified trees, and the skeletal remains of buildings that seemed to defy gravity, frozen mid-collapse. We passed a time fossil, a tree fused with a rusted car chassis, a relic of the fracture, a stark example of the chaotic merging of different moments in time. It emitted a temporal distortion, a slight warping of the air around it, detectable on our gauntlets as a localized fluctuation in the crimson lines. We passed through a time echo, an area where sounds from the past played on an endless loop. The ghostly laughter of children, a snippet of a forgotten broadcast, the rumble of a long-dead engine. We passed an area where the dust particles hung in the air, almost motionless, and the silence was deeper, more profound. Owen, who was more sensitive to these things, stumbled, his face pale. It was always worse for him. He never really got used to navigating this fractured world. I gripped his arm, steadying him. "You all right, kid?" The air around him shimmered, as if his perception of time was affecting the immediate environment. "Yeah," he said, his voice strained. "Just dizzy. And this headache." When he touched his gauntlet, the shimmer around him intensified. He concentrated, his eyes squeezed shut for a moment. I knew he was visualizing the temporal currents, translating the raw data from his gauntlet into something he could comprehend. "It's the harmonics," he added, gesturing with his gauntlet, his voice tight with pain. "They're stronger here, like ripples in a pond, but messier, more chaotic, each distortion with its own unique signature. Like a fingerprint, but for a moment in time." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "There," he said, pointing towards the horizon, his finger tracing the lines only he could see. "The epicenter. That's where the signal's strongest. It's a temporal displacement field of some kind. It's like something's trying to punch through from another time, creating these ripples, these harmonics that are destabilizing the area, causing the new time scar to form." We pressed on, drawn forward by the increasingly insistent two-tone signal. It felt like we were approaching not just a location, but a threshold, a boundary between the known and the unknown. Rounding a ridge of fractured rock, we saw something. My breath caught in my throat, a disbelieving noise that was half gasp, half chuckle. It rose from the wasteland, an edifice of chrome and neon. It shouldn't have been there. It couldn't have been there. But it was. A diner. A classic 1950s-style American diner, all chrome and polished steel, rising out of the wasteland like a mirage. It looked structurally intact but not pristine. The chrome was slightly tarnished, the once bright colors of the interior were faded, and a fine layer of dust coated some surfaces. The windows were hazy, covered in a film of that same dust, obscuring the view inside. It was as if the diner had been abandoned, left to the ravages of time, yet somehow preserved, protected from the worst of the fracture's effects. The resonance scanner was going crazy now, the two-tone signal almost deafening. The chrono gauntlets were picking up massive temporal distortions. The diner was the epicenter, the source of the anomaly. The temporal readings formed a complex web around the structure, a vortex of swirling energy lines, each line a different shade of crimson, from deep burgundy to a pale, almost pink hue. Owen stared, his eyes wide. "What the?" "Don't know," I said, my hand reaching for the phase disruptor at my side. It was a heavy, cumbersome weapon, a last resort for dealing with unstable anomalies. "But we're about to find out, you ken." We approached cautiously. The diner's windows were dark, but a neon sign above the door was working, casting a warm, inviting glow that seemed strangely out of place in the desolate landscape. It wasn't a steady light. It blinked in sync with the two-tone signal emanating from the diner, a visual echo of the temporal distortions. "Starry Diner," it read, in a classic cursive script, the neon tubing slightly askew, casting odd shadows on the diner's dusty facade. And beneath it, in smaller letters, "Open 24/7. There was a light on inside too. "This is strange," Owen muttered. "It's like it's frozen in time." "Not frozen," I corrected, tapping my gauntlet. "Distorted. There's some kind of temporal displacement field in there. A big one. And it's unstable. It's interacting with the surrounding temporal fabric, creating these harmonics." I pointed to the new time scar, still shimmering in the distance, its edges now tinged with an eerie violet hue. "It's making things worse. We need to investigate this. This could destabilize the whole sector. Command won't be pleased if we lose another chunk of stable time." Ford's voice came over the comms again. "What's the situation, Point Man? You find something?" I found myself frozen. This was it. Protocol was clear. Report the anomaly, await instructions, and, if necessary, neutralize it. But something held me back. A feeling, a hunch. This wasn't just another anomaly. This was something different. "We found something," I said finally. "Something you need to see, Ford. Get down here. And bring your gear. We're going in." The diner stood before us, a relic of a bygone era, a ghost in the wasteland. As we stepped towards its entrance, I heard something melodic, almost like a song, a two-note sequence repeating endlessly, each repetition subtly different, a haunting melody that seemed to burrow its way into my mind, evoking a sense of unease, of anticipation, of something unknown yet strangely familiar. The interior was dim, lit only by the few overhead fixtures that swayed gently, casting distorted shadows that stretched and contracted with the uneven light, like phantoms dancing to a silent tune. The rhythmic swaying was slightly hypnotic. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and dust, a scent that spoke of disuse and abandonment. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, their color faded, cracked and worn, like dried blood on old leather. A long chrome counter, dulled with a film of grime, ran the length of the room, punctuated by swivel stools with ripped and faded red seats. A few had fallen over, as if knocked down in a hurry. A menu board hung askew above the counter, displaying a list of classic diner fare in faded lettering, the prices strangely low, even for a bygone era. Behind the counter, a coffee machine stood cold and silent, its glass carafe half full of a dark liquid that might have once been coffee. A half-eaten piece of pie sat on a plate nearby, the filling congealed and lifeless, covered in a layer of dust. The diner was not just dusty, it was dirty, like it had seen a rush of customers and no one had bothered to clean up. In the corner, a jukebox stood silent, its colourful lights dark, its chrome surface reflecting the light in a distorted, fractured way. It was an old Wurlitzer, all curves and chrome, a relic of a time when music came from physical records, not thin air. As we moved further inside, we saw the patrons. They were frozen, not like statues, but like figures in a poorly paused holovid, caught mid-action, their movements suspended in a fractured moment of time. A man in a worn fedora and a stained apron stood near the counter, a white cloth in his hand, as if interrupted while polishing its surface. His other hand was raised, fingers slightly curled, as if about to scratch his chin, his face frozen in an expression of mild concentration, his eyes staring blankly ahead, unfocused. In one of the booths, a woman in a floral dress stared intently at a locket in her hand. her face etched with a perpetual sadness, her other hand resting on the table, fingers loosely curled around a worn photograph, the image facing down, its contents hidden from view. A man in a rumpled suit sat rigidly in another booth, a newspaper held open in front of him, but his eyes were fixed not on the paper, but on some distant point beyond the wall, his brow furrowed, his mouth slightly open as if about to speak. Near the counter, a woman with short, dark, disheveled hair sat on a stool, both hands wrapped around a ceramic coffee cup. The cup was filled to the brim with the same dark liquid as in the coffee machine's carafe. Not a drop spilled, despite the precarious angle of her hands. But the hand closest to us was trembling, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor that belied the apparent stillness of the scene. It created tiny ripples on the coffee's surface. Every so often, she would murmur something, a phrase that seemed to make no sense. The numbers, they need to align. Her voice a low, almost inaudible monotone, a stark contrast to the forced stillness of her form. She repeated the phrase, each time with the same inflection, the same cadence, as if stuck in a loop, a broken record playing the same snippet of sound over and over again. It was Owen who finally broke the silence. "The jukebox," he breathed, his eyes fixed on the silent machine in the corner. "It's the source, the two-tone signal. It's like it's resonating with the temporal field, amplifying it, shaping it somehow, like a tuning fork for time. And the signal, it's like a carrier wave, modulating the field, creating these harmonics." He pointed with his gauntlet, tracing patterns in the air only he could see. "Chromium," I murmured. "A rare temporal element." I stared at the jukebox, a strange sense of unease settling in my gut. I had only heard of it in theory, in old research papers from before the fracture. It was believed to be a key component in many experimental time-related technologies, but its properties were not fully understood. It was said to be highly reactive to certain frequencies, particularly sound waves. Owen was right. It was the jukebox. Not just any jukebox, but a Wurlitzer, a specific model I recognized from old holovids. The 1015, they called it. The bubbler, a classic. This one, though, was different. Modified. The usual array of buttons, each one a song title, was replaced by a single, unlabeled red button, worn smooth with use. It was connected to a series of wires that snaked into the machine's innards, disappearing into a tangle of circuitry that was definitely not standard issue. It looked like a jury-rigged modification, a crude attempt to control the machine's functions. This wasn't just playing music, it was doing something else, something with the temporal field. The machine was a focal point, a conductor for the chromium's energy. "Chromium," I said again. "That's what's powering this thing. It's highly reactive, especially to sonic frequencies. You were right about the harmonics, Owen. The music, it's not just playing. It's modulating the chromium, creating a feedback loop, amplifying the temporal displacement field. Each note, each chord, is a specific frequency that interacts with the chromium in a unique way, creating a complex web of temporal distortions." The two-tone signal was a carrier wave, a basic frequency that was being modulated by the chromium, creating the more complex harmonic patterns we were detecting. The specific two-note sequence, endlessly repeating, each repetition subtly different, was creating a resonance effect, amplifying the temporal displacement field, causing it to expand and destabilize the surrounding area. I suddenly realized that the two-tone signal was familiar. It was a fragment of the Fracture song, the distorted melody I often heard echoing in the wasteland. It wasn't just a fragment, but a recurring motif, a fundamental building block of the song's structure. The diner wasn't just an anomaly, it was directly linked to the larger phenomenon of the fracture. "It's like a song," Owen said, "a song that's warp in time." "The Ballad of Broken Time," I muttered, a dark chuckle escaping my lips. Ford's boots crunched on the floor as he finally entered the diner, his eyes sweeping across the frozen tableau. He whistled low, a sharp, piercing sound that seemed to momentarily disrupt the stillness. "Well, ain't this a sight?" he said, his voice laced with his usual cynicism. "Looks like a goddamn museum exhibit. Or a waxworks. Creepy as hell." His eyes, hardened by years in the wasteland, lingered on the frozen patrons. He carried his usual gear, a modified chrono gauntlet, similar to ours but with additional sensor arrays and a reinforced casing. A battered resonance scanner, held together with duct tape and salvaged parts. And a heavy plasma-based sidearm holstered at his hip. But there was something else, tucked into his belt. A worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one eye missing. He caught me looking and shrugged, a rare flicker of something other than cynicism in his eyes. Desperation, maybe? Or regret? "Souvenir," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. It was a subtle incongruity in his otherwise hardened demeanor, a hint of a softer side he rarely showed. A relic from his past, a reminder of what he had lost. He gestured to the frozen patrons with his chin. "What's the story here, Point Man? They part of the anomaly?" "They're caught in it," I explained. "Like flies in amber, you ken? They're not alive, not in the traditional sense. More like echoes. Degraded simulations, residual energy patterns trapped in a loop by the temporal field. They are exhibiting glitches, though." I pointed to the man near the counter. "He keeps trying to light a cigarette, but the lighter never catches. A futile attempt to recapture a lost moment." In one of the booths, the woman in the floral dress still stared at her locket. But now, a single tear, frozen on her cheek, glinted in the dim light. The man in the rumpled suit, previously frozen mid-bite, now muttered something, his voice a low, distorted rumble. "Out of phase. Frequency's wrong." And the woman on the stool repeated her cryptic phrase. "The numbers. They need to align." Her voice a fractured echo in the stillness. Ford grunted, his eyes shifting to the jukebox. "That thing's the source, ain't it? Chromium, you said?" "Yeah," I confirmed. "Modified Wurlitzer, rigged to modulate the chromium, amplify the field. It's creating a localized distortion, a bubble of unstable time, and it's growing. It's pulling energy from the surrounding area, creating those harmonics Owen mentioned, destabilizing the temporal fabric." I paused, then added, "It's also pulling us in, affecting our equipment, even our perception. The longer we stay here, the more unstable it gets." Ford approached the jukebox, his hand hovering over the worn red button. "So we shut it down, right? Pull the plug, so to speak." "Hold on, Ford," I said, raising a hand to stop him. "We don't know what that button does. Could be a trigger, a failsafe, anything. This isn't just some old music box, it's a temporal shunt, a prototype and a damaged one at that. It's unstable." Ford scoffed. "So what's the plan, Point Man? We sit here and admire it? That thing's a ticking time bomb, literally. The longer we wait, the worse it gets." He gestured with his chin towards the diner's entrance, where the new time scar was still visible, a wound in the distance, its edges shimmering with that unsettling violet hue. "We need to understand it," I insisted. "Figure out how it works, how to shut it down safely. A sudden surge could destabilize the entire sector, maybe even trigger another fracture. We need to find a way to counteract the harmonics, stabilize the field, you ken, before we even think about touching that button." I paused, considering our options. "Owen, you mentioned manipulating temporal energy, like sound waves. Is there a way to create some kind of interference, disrupt the resonance?" Owen, who had been silently observing, spoke up. "Maybe. We know certain temporal energies can be manipulated similarly to sound waves. The gauntlets can generate a localized field, a modulated energy emission. If we can tune it to the right frequency, create a sort of temporal countercurrent, we might be able to disrupt the resonance, dampen the harmonics." Earlier, he had mentioned during a lull in our trek that certain temporal energies could be manipulated similarly to sound waves, a theory he was still developing. Now he seemed to be applying that theory in practice. "Think of it like this," he continued, trying to explain. We know that sound waves can be cancelled out by creating an opposing wave, right? A sort of anti-noise. Maybe we can do something similar with temporal energy. The gauntlets can generate a localized field, a modulated energy emission. If we can tune it to the right frequency, create a sort of temporal countercurrent, we might be able to disrupt the resonance, dampen the harmonics. A countercurrent, I repeated, my mind trying to grasp the concept. You mean disrupt the feedback loop by introducing an opposing energy signature? Exactly, Owen said, excitement in his eyes. We need to find the right frequency, the right waveform, to counteract the jukebox's signal. It's like tuning an instrument, but instead of musical notes, we're dealing with temporal harmonics. He tapped his gauntlet. The gauntlets can generate a localized field, a modulated energy emission. If we can synchronize it with the diner's temporal signature, we might be able to create a dampening effect. It won't be perfect, but it might buy us some time. It was a risky proposition, based on a theoretical concept, but it was the only option we had. I looked at Ford, who still seemed unconvinced, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that a direct shutdown was too dangerous. All right, kid, I said, turning back to Owen. Let's see what you can do, but be careful. One wrong move, and we could all be in a different kind of time warp. Owen nodded, his face set in concentration. He began to adjust the settings on his gauntlet. The air around him crackled as he calibrated the device, creating a localized field that interacted with the diner's temporal signature. The display on his gauntlet showed a complex waveform, a visual representation of the temporal currents, shifting and changing in response to his adjustments. It was as if he were wrestling with an invisible force, trying to bend it to his will. Almost got it. Need to isolate the dominant frequency, the two-tone signal. He opened his eyes, a look of focused determination on his face. I've got it locked. It should disrupt the resonance, dampen the harmonics, stabilize the field, at least for a while. All right, I said, stepping back. Do it, but be ready to cut it if things go south. Owen took a deep breath, then activated his gauntlet. A low, almost subaudible thrumming filled the air, a modulated energy emission that created a visible distortion around the device. The two-tone signal from the jukebox seemed to fluctuate, its rhythm disrupted, its intensity diminished. The frozen patrons remained unchanged, but their glitches seemed to lessen in frequency. The man's hand, perpetually reaching for his lighter, now twitched less often. The woman's tear remained frozen, but its shimmer seemed less pronounced. It's having an effect, Owen said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. The harmonics are dampening, the field is stabilizing, but it's temporary. We've bought ourselves some time, but we need to figure out how to shut this thing down permanently. Not bad, kid, Ford conceded, a grudging respect in his voice. But we're still on the clock. Let's not waste it. He still kept his hand near his weapon, his eyes scanning our surroundings. As the energy emission from Owen's gauntlet filled the diner, I decided to take a closer look at the jukebox itself, at the source of the anomaly. I approached it cautiously, my hand hovering over the worn red button, my eyes scanning the modified controls, the tangle of wires that snaked into the machine's innards. It was a crude modification, a jury-rigged system that looked almost amateurish, yet it was undeniably effective. Intrigued, I ran my fingers along the metal of the jukebox casing, tracing the path of the wires that connected the mysterious red button to the machine's internal mechanisms. As my fingers brushed against a small inscription carved into the metal near the base of the button, a sudden jolt, like static electricity, surged through me. The diner shimmered, the dusty, dilapidated reality flickering, momentarily replaced by glimpses of a brighter, more vibrant past. I saw the diner as it once was, filled with people, movement, and the sounds of a lively crowd. I caught snatches of conversation, fragmented and distorted, like a radio tuned to a weak signal. I saw the faces of the originals, the people the patrons were based on, but only in fleeting, partial images, their features obscured, their expressions difficult to decipher. The faces were indistinct, like figures in a faded photograph, their features blurred and distorted by the passage of time and the instability of the temporal field. It wasn't a full vision, not like stepping into the past. It was more like seeing a fractured reflection, a series of disjointed images and sounds superimposed onto the present. I was still aware of the dilapidated diner around me, of Owen's efforts with the gauntlet, of Ford's watchful presence, but at the same time I was perceiving remnants of a different time, echoes of a reality that no longer existed. I saw a brief, fragmented scene of people rushing toward the basement door in panic, their movements frantic. I heard snatches of their conversation, their voices distorted by the temporal interference. They were shouting about the pods, the lifeboat, and the fracture. The two-tone distortion was loud, almost overwhelming. It was a chaotic scene, a moment of sheer terror frozen in time. Then, as quickly as it began, the vision faded, the images receding, the sounds dissolving into the almost subaudible thrumming from Owen's gauntlet. I was back in the present, the dusty diner solid around me once more. "You all right, Point Man?" Ford's voice, edged with concern, seemed to come from a great distance. "You look like you've had a close encounter with a time scar, like something's knocked you sideways." "Something like that," I said, my voice rough. "There's a basement. We need to check it out." Ford raised an eyebrow. "A basement? What's gotten into you?" "I saw it," I said, urgency lacing my words. "A vision, a memory, call it what you will. It was tied to the jukebox, to the cronium. I saw the diner's past, fragments of it, the originals, the people these echoes are based on. I saw them just before the fracture hit. They were running towards the basement, panicked, shouting about pods and a lifeboat. This whole place, this diner, it was part of something bigger, something called Project Lifeboat." Ford's eyes narrowed. "A vision? You've been out in the wastes too long, Point Man. You're starting to see things." But despite his words, he followed me as I moved towards the back of the diner, towards a narrow, nondescript door partially hidden behind a stack of dusty crates. It was the kind of door that was easy to miss, designed to blend into the background. "Stay here, Owen," I called over my shoulder. "Keep that field steady. We'll check out the basement. Holler if anything changes." "Got it," Owen replied. "But hurry, this thing's draining my gauntlet fast." The door was unlocked. A set of narrow wooden stairs led down into the darkness. The only light came from our gauntlets, the beams cutting through the gloom. The rhythmic two-tone signal from the jukebox above intensified as we descended, resonating in the confined space. The basement was a utilitarian space, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. A single bare light bulb cast a dim, unsettling light over the room. And then we saw the pods, at least a dozen, dominating the center of the room. They were metallic, cylindrical structures, each about 7 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, with a single circular window of thick, reinforced glass at chest level. They looked like a cross between a cryogenic chamber and an iron lung, a fusion of advanced technology and something almost archaic. The pods were connected to a network of pipes and cables that snaked across the floor, disappearing into the walls and ceiling. A thick layer of dust covered the pods, but through the grimy glass, we could see the skeletal remains inside. Each pod contained a single human skeleton, the bones yellowed with age, still clad in the tattered remnants of clothing. In one, the skeleton clutched a tarnished locket, its surface reflecting the dim light like a malevolent eye. In another, a child-sized skeleton, its tiny, fragile bones a stark reminder of the human cost of the fracture. The skeleton clutched a worn, stuffed animal, a rabbit with one ear missing and fabric worn thin with age, a detail that seemed to gut-punch Ford, his usual cynicism faltering for a moment. "Damn," Ford breathed. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing the dust from the glass of the nearest pod. The skeletal remains inside stared back, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow our every move. I moved closer, my gauntlet casting a glow on the scene. These were the originals, the people I had glimpsed in my vision. the people the diner patrons were based on. This was their lifeboat, their refuge from the fracture. But something had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. "They're dead," Ford stated the obvious, his voice grim. "Yeah," I said, my eyes sweeping across the room. I noticed a scattering of documents on the floor near one of the pods, their pages yellowed and brittle, covered in a layer of dust. I knelt down, carefully picking up one of the documents, its edges crumbling at my touch. The document was a technical report, filled with diagrams, equations, and jargon I could barely understand. But the heading at the top of the page was clear. Project Lifeboat, Temporal Displacement Field, Prototype Design. Project Lifeboat. The words resonated in my mind, a chilling confirmation of what I had seen in my vision. This diner, the jukebox, the pods, it was all part of a desperate attempt to escape the fracture, to create a self-contained bubble of stable time. As I scanned the document, certain phrases jumped out, phrases that shed light on the project's purpose. Temporal displacement field, chromium resonance, life support system, digital consciousness matrix. One recurring diagram caught my eye, a complex series of interlocking rings labeled Resonance Cascade Matrix. It looked vaguely familiar, like a more complex version of the patterns Owen saw in the temporal currents. The symbols on the diagram matched some of those on the jukebox dial, a clear connection between the two. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. This was their plan, a lifeboat. They used chromium, the same stuff in the jukebox, to create a temporal displacement field, a bubble of stable time isolated from the fracture. The diner was the anchor point, the focal point for the field. The pods, they were for life support, and something else. I picked up another document, this one a medical report, detailing the physiological and psychological effects of prolonged exposure to a temporal displacement field. It mentioned the transfer of consciousness to a digital matrix, a sort of digital backup designed to preserve the individual's mental state in the event of physical death. But the document was filled with warnings. Incomplete data, unpredictable results, potential for fragmentation. They tried to digitize their minds, I said, a chilling realization settling in. Transfer their consciousness to a digital matrix, a computer simulation maintained by the temporal field, a crude form of digital immortality. The patrons upstairs, they're not just echoes, they're digital remnants, projections, memories, stored in the system, powered by the chromium, kept in a loop by that damn jukebox. Fragmented, degraded versions of the originals trapped in an endless cycle, a digital purgatory. Ford stared at the pods. So, they tried to cheat time, cheat death, and they failed. The fracture hit, the system malfunctioned, and they were trapped. Their bodies died, but their digital selves, they're still up there playing out their last day over and over again. A twisted digital Groundhog Day. Project Lifeboat, a desperate last-ditch effort to preserve a small group of people from the fracture, had become their tomb. The chromium, intended to be their shield, had become their prison, trapping their digital remnants in an endless fractured echo of their final moments. The temporal synchronization failed, I murmured. The field became unstable, parasitic. It started draining energy from the surrounding timeline, creating the harmonics, the time scars. It's still doing it. That's why the anomaly is growing. The jukebox, it's not just playing music. It's modulating the chromium, maintaining the field, keeping the digital remnants trapped in their loop. But it's also destabilizing the area, pulling us in, affecting our equipment. So what do we do? Ford asked. We can't just leave them like this. And we can't let that damn jukebox keep tearing up the timeline. He looked genuinely conflicted, a rare display of emotion for the hardened cartographer. We need to shut it down, I said, my mind racing, trying to find a solution in the cryptic diagrams and equations. But we need to do it right. We need to find a way to sever the connection between the chromium and the digital matrix, to stop the loop without causing another surge. Maybe that resonance cascade matrix is the key. Some kind of sequence, a specific set of frequencies that need to be disrupted, like the two-tone signal, but more complex. We need to understand how the jukebox interfaces with the matrix, how the music is translated into temporal manipulations. I looked at the scattered documents, at the diagrams and equations, searching for a solution, a way out of this temporal maze. The answer I knew was hidden somewhere in the remnants of Project Lifeboat, in the failed technology that had created this tragic, twisted echo of the past. We had a limited amount of time before Owen's improvised solution wore off, before the anomaly expanded further, before the entire sector became unstable. They were trying to escape the end of the world, I murmured. But they just ended up creating their own little pocket apocalypse. A wave of empathy, unexpected and unwelcome, washed over me. "So, the music," Ford said, breaking the silence, his focus fixed on the documents in my hand. "It's not just playing, it's controlling the field, keeping them trapped in that twisted loop." "Yeah," I replied, my eyes scanning the diagrams of the resonance cascade matrix. Specific frequencies, rhythms. The two-tone signal is just the most obvious part. It's like a carrier wave modulating the chromium, creating the harmonics. But there's more to it. A whole sequence, a complex symphony of temporal manipulation. It's all in here somewhere. This whole thing was orchestrated. The jukebox was the key. It wasn't just a music player, it was a temporal instrument, and the music it played was a set of instructions, a code that interacted with the chromium to create and maintain the temporal displacement field. I looked at the documents again, focusing on the diagrams of the resonance cascade matrix. The interlocking rings, the symbols, the equations. They were a map, a guide to the jukebox's function. "That's it," I murmured, tracing the notation with my finger. "The sequence that throws the whole system into reverse. It had to be. A failsafe, a way to shut it all down." "What is it?" Ford asked, his voice tense. "A sequence," I explained. "A specific set of frequencies that triggers the chromium, creates the field. If we can reverse it, play the sequence backward, maybe we can collapse the field, shut down the loop." "And the patrons?" Ford asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "They're already gone, Ford," I said softly. "We'd be giving them peace, you ken, finally letting them rest, putting them out of their misery. It's a mercy, really." "And how do we do that?" Ford asked. "We don't exactly have a piano down here to play this reverse sequence." "The jukebox," I said. "It's the only way. It's designed to generate these frequencies. We just need to figure out how to reprogram it, play the sequence in reverse. It's our instrument of temporal surgery." We returned to the diner, the almost sub-audible thrumming from Owen's gauntlet, a constant reminder of the limited time we had. Owen looked exhausted, but the dampening field was still holding, the two-tone signal from the jukebox suppressed. He was essentially wrestling with the temporal anomaly, using his gauntlet to counteract its effects. "Any luck?" he asked, his voice strained, his eyes bloodshot. "Maybe," I said. "We need to reprogram the jukebox, play a specific sequence in reverse, the temporal dissonance cascade. It's our only shot at shutting this thing down safely." Owen looked at the jukebox, his eyes narrowed. "The music, it's not just sound, it's information, data. Each note, each chord is a specific frequency that interacts with the chromium, creating a resonance effect. The sequence, it's like a musical code, a set of instructions for the temporal field." He ran his hand through his already messy hair, a nervous tic he displayed when deep in thought. He moved closer to the machine, his gauntlet held out in front of him, analyzing the complex patterns of the temporal currents. I could almost see the gears turning in his head as he processed the data. "I can see it now," he murmured. "The two-tone signal is just the carrier wave. There are other frequencies layered beneath it, a whole spectrum of sound that we can't hear, but the chromium can. It's like a hidden melody, a secret language that only the chromium understands. And it's all controlled by this," he said, tapping the jukebox with his gauntlet. "This is the conductor of this twisted orchestra." As he focused on the jukebox, his gauntlet began to display a series of shifting, three-dimensional patterns, like a complex, ever-changing geometric shape. "When I touch the casing," he explained, "I can feel the vibrations, the different frequencies. It's like the machine is humming a tune, a complex melody that we can't hear with our ears. But my gauntlet can pick it up. It's translating the temporal energy into something I can almost taste. It's metallic, with an undertone that's almost sweet. It's hard to describe. Each frequency has a unique signature, a different flavor, if you will. And the sequence, the order in which they're played, that's what determines the effect on the temporal field. It's like a recipe, and the chromium is the ingredient that reacts to these specific instructions." "So how do we change the melody?" Ford asked impatiently. "How do we play this reverse sequence?" "The button," I said, pointing to the worn red button on the jukebox's modified control panel. "It's not just a start button, it's a selector, a way to choose different sequences. The original designers must have programmed it with multiple options, different songs for different functions. We need to find the right sequence, the one that reverses the temporal dissonance cascade." I paused, considering the challenge. "It's like a combination lock, but instead of numbers, we're dealing with frequencies." "And how do we do that?" Ford repeated, his frustration evident. "Trial and error? We don't have time for that." He pointed to the documents, his voice rising slightly. "We have the sequence, but how do we input it into this damn machine?" "The documents," I said. "The resonance cascade matrix. It's a map, a guide to the different sequences. The symbols on the matrix match the symbols on the jukebox's dial. Each symbol represents a specific frequency, a note in the song. If we can decipher the matrix, find the temporal dissonance cascade, we can figure out how to input it into the jukebox." I spread the documents out on the counter, the diagrams and equations swimming before my eyes. "Think of it like this," Owen added, trying to explain in simpler terms. "The jukebox is like a musical instrument, and the chromium is like the strings. Each frequency, each note, causes the chromium to vibrate in a specific way, creating the temporal field. The sequence is like a musical score, a set of instructions that tells the chromium which notes to play and in what order. We need to find the right score, the one that unplays the field." We gathered around the jukebox, the documents spread out on the dusty counter. The symbols on the matrix were complex, abstract, but there was a logic to them, a pattern. It was like a musical score, but instead of notes, it used symbols to represent frequencies. Each symbol was unique, a stylized representation of a specific frequency, a note in the temporal symphony. Owen, with his intuitive understanding of temporal energy, was able to translate the symbols, to see the underlying patterns. "Each symbol represents a specific frequency," he explained, tracing the lines on the diagram with his finger. "And the order of the symbols determines the sequence, the order in which the frequencies are played. It's like a musical code, a language that the chromium understands." He pointed to a series of symbols on the matrix. "This is the two-tone signal, the carrier wave. And these others, these are the supporting frequencies, the ones that create the harmonics that shape the field." "The temporal dissonance cascade," I said, my eyes scanning the matrix. "It has to be here somewhere." I ran my finger along the lines of the matrix, searching for the specific sequence that would undo the field. We worked together, cross-referencing the documents, comparing the symbols on the matrix with the symbols on the jukebox's dial. It was a painstaking process, like deciphering an ancient language, but slowly we began to make progress. Each symbol we deciphered was a small victory, a step closer to understanding the complex workings of the machine. And then we found it, the temporal dissonance cascade, a series of 12 symbols arranged in a specific order. It was the key, the code to initiate the temporal displacement field. Now we needed to reverse it. "We need to play the sequence backward," I said, Start from the last symbol and work our way to the first. That should, in theory, collapse the field. I pointed to the first symbol in the reversed sequence. This is where we start. And how do we play it? Ford asked, gesturing to the jukebox's single red button. We can't just tap out a rhythm and hope for the best. The button, Owen said, his eyes fixed on the worn red button. It's a multi-function input. We press it in a specific pattern, corresponding to the reversed sequence. Each press represents a symbol, a frequency. It's like Morse code, but with temporal energy instead of dots and dashes. He paused, then added, but it's more complex than that. It's not just about the number of presses, but also the duration, the pressure. Each symbol corresponds to a unique combination of these factors. It's like a fingerprint, a unique signature for each frequency. It was a risky plan, based on a complex series of deductions and assumptions, but we had to trust in the logic of the Project Lifeboat designers in their desperate attempt to control time. We had to believe that they had created a failsafe, a way to undo what they had done. I took a deep breath, then began to press the red button in the reversed sequence, following the order of the symbols we had deciphered from the resonance cascade matrix. Each press was accompanied by a soft click, a subtle change in the two-tone signal, a shift in the underlying frequencies. The first press was short and firm. The second, a longer, more sustained press. The third, 2 quick taps, followed by a delayed third. With each press, the two-tone signal seemed to change, becoming more complex, more layered. The diner seemed to hold its breath. The frozen patrons remained motionless, their glitches now completely absent, as if the dampening field had finally brought them a semblance of peace. It was as if they were waiting, suspended between existence and oblivion, for the final note to be played. As I pressed the button for the final time, a long, sustained press, followed by a quick release, a low hum filled the diner. The two-tone signal ceased altogether, and the jukebox fell silent. A wave of energy, visible as a ripple in the air, emanated from the jukebox, washing over the frozen patrons. And then, slowly, the frozen patrons began to fade. Their forms shimmered, becoming translucent, like holograms losing their signal. The colors of their clothing, already muted, turned to shades of grey, then disappeared altogether. The woman's locket, the last vestige of her simulated existence, flickered and vanished. One by one they vanished, dissolving into thin air, leaving behind only an empty diner, filled with the ghosts of a forgotten past. The digital remnants, the echoes of Project Lifeboat, were finally at peace. It was a silent farewell, a quiet end to a long, twisted journey. Owen lowered his gauntlet, the thrumming gone. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "The field is collapsing. The anomaly is gone." He looked around the diner, a mixture of relief and sadness in his eyes. The new time scar, which had been visible through the diner's entrance, was gone, the ochre haze of the wasteland uninterrupted once more. Ford let out a long sigh, a mixture of relief and something akin to sadness. He looked around the empty diner, his focus lingering on the spot where the woman in the floral dress had stood, her locket forever clutched in her hand. He picked up a worn, faded photograph from the scattered pile of Project Lifeboat documents. It was a picture of the diner, taken in its heyday, long before the fracture. In the photo, the diner was vibrant and full of life. People filled the booths, laughing and talking, their faces full of a carefree joy that was now absent from the wasteland. A young couple shared a milkshake at the counter, their eyes locked in a gaze full of unspoken promises. A group of children huddled around the jukebox, their faces illuminated by its colourful glow. He placed the photograph gently on the counter, a silent tribute to the lives lost, to the dreams shattered by the fracture, a memento of a time that would never return. A tangible link to the humanity that Project Lifeboat had tried and failed to preserve. We stood there for a long moment, the three of us in the silence of the empty diner. We had done it. We had shut down the anomaly, averted a potential catastrophe. But the victory felt hollow, tinged with the melancholy of what had been lost. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the jukebox, at the silent machine that had held the echoes of a bygone era. Project Lifeboat had failed, its ambitious dream of escaping the fracture turning into a digital nightmare. But in its failure, it had also created something unique, something both tragic and beautiful, a requiem for a dream, a haunting melody of hope and loss, echoing in the silence of the wasteland. It was a story etched in time, a lesson learned the hard way. We still had a job to do, a broken world to mend, one fractured piece of time at a time, you ken. But for now there was a sense of closure, a feeling that a chapter had ended, a wrong had been righted. The echoes of yesterday were finally laid to rest.